Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Humanities Kansas Big Idea Presentation. I am Freddy Gipp, enrolled member of the Apache Tribe of Oklahoma, Digital Program Manager for Humanities Kansas, and your co-host along with Dr. Valerie Mendoza, Director of the Title III Strengthening Institutions Grant at Washburn University. The Big Idea, which is a monthly online series that highlights fresh thinking on humanities topics through brief essays and online interviews. Last season highlighted Black scholars emphasizing past and present work and how it has impacted their careers and communities. And for this season, we are transitioning our focus to elevate and explore Indigenous scholarship in Kansas. Today's Big Idea presentation, titled Turning Land Acknowledgments into Action in a Good Way, examines what can be done to fully understand the intricate situation both non-natives and native communities experience, whether it is willful ignorant or not. Our special guest today is Dr. Alex Redcorn, citizen of the Osage Nation and Executive Director of the Kansas Association for Native American Education, an Assistant Professor of Educational Leadership and Coordinator for Indigenous Partnerships in the College of Education at Kansas State University. Dr. Redcorn, it's always a pleasure to see you. Thank you for joining us today. How's everything going?
It's going well, and thank you for having me. I'm in a hotel in San Diego. I'm at a conference right now between sessions, and so yeah, I got the sun on me, but yeah, looking forward to the conversation here today.
Sounds good. And I'm on an iPad in Lawrence, Kansas. So before we begin, the format of our discussion is very simple. As Dr. Mendoza and I will alternate on questions relating to your essay, career, and other relatable topics in today's Big Idea. And towards the end of the program, we'll allow those in the audience to ask questions through the webinar Q&A and chat feature, which I think I'll have probably Dr. Mendoza look at since I can't really see that on my iPad. So Dr. Mendoza, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Freddie. Hello, Dr. Redcorn. It's nice to be able to talk to you. So let's get right to it, because this is such an exciting a topic that is really interesting. So in your Big Idea, you talk about what you call the drum and feather exhibitions of diversity put on by various organizations throughout the country during Native American Heritage Month or cultural fairs. So can you elaborate on that and why these types of events might be problematic?
Well, so first off, thanks for having me, and appreciate the invite here from Humanities Kansas, and appreciate the space to have this conversation. And so to the question, I think one of the key things is that it's not inherently problematic on its own. So giving students space to show who they are at cultural fairs and bring in dancers and singers, and especially if students are the dancers and singers along with their elder community members, I think those are really excellent things. The problem is when people are trying to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work, or belonging as well, a lot of times people create a situation where they invite people into the gymnasium and they have that event, and then that's it. That's the only thing that happens. And if we really back up and think about an entire school year, and think about our Native students and all students going through an entire school year, every single class, every single assignment, every single reading, if all they get is one photo opportunity to see American Indian students showing who they are culturally, and it's just an add-on, it's a tack on to the actual learning system. And so that's one thing I always describe, is that a lot of times American Indians, we have our core learning system, and that system works, and it's primed. It's been primed over decades and generations to teach certain topics. Textbooks are aligned with it. There's curricular standards at the state level. There are curricular decisions at the district level. There are curricular decisions at the classroom level. And quite often, American Indians are just kind of like an add-on to a Eurocentric narrative. And so the drum and feather context that I tend to talk about are good. Those are great opportunities, but they tend to be like, that's it. And so then you're not necessarily teaching kids about what tribal sovereignty is. about the Marshall Trilogy, about what a domestic dependent nation is, about who are the 4 tribes in Kansas right now, who are the 20 to 30 plus tribes that moved through Kansas at some point in time, and where are they now in their contemporary form. And so really, when I say drum and feather context can become problematic, it's because sometimes it's almost like a show for non-natives, and then that's it. And it allows people to think we've done something very culturally responsive, which you have. I'll acknowledge that, but then that's it. And there's no changing of textbooks, there's no changing of lesson plans, there's no changing of the deeper story of what American Indians are in this contemporary form, because some people just had an opportunity to get a photo op and they feel good about it for them, in those ways, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that actually segues really nicely into my next question, because when we talk about those learning standards, when we talk about what students are being taught in schools, all the way up to university, right? We often what's often introduced can be stereotypes, and more often than not, it's of the past, right? And so it gives that impression that, you and other scholars have said that, Native Americans only live in the past. So can you kind of talk about some of those stuck in the past stereotypes, the phrase that you use in your big idea, and more importantly, how can we go about replacing these stereotypes to give a fuller representation of Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, so the core issue is, as I was saying, is these systems of learning, and we have to recognize that at its core, everybody who is leading our systems of learning right now went through those K through 12 systems of learning, and they also graduated, went to college, and got trained in teaching, and they got trained in leadership. And throughout all of those systems of learning, there's really not a lot to help push back against those stereotypes. And so a key statistic that gets thrown around a lot, Sarah Shear and a group of scholars, a well-cited publication, did a national study of social studies standards across the United States in 2015. And they found that about 87% of all social studies standards about American Indians are about them in a pre-1900 context. So by design, 87% of what everybody in the country is supposed to learn about American Indians is that stereotype. There's not a whole lot of visibility of any learning that happens after 1900. So it becomes difficult for people to understand who a contemporary Indian is, and these status quos and these stereotypes keep replicating themselves. And so we have to interrupt that system of learning in some way, shape, or form. So furthermore, this is reinforced by stuff that Sarah Shear and another group of scholars did a follow-up study, came out last year, I think, where they also found that there are many states that are anemic in teaching about tribal sovereignty. So if we think about like the substance of what can be taught in our schools to move past these stereotypes, helping people understand what tribal sovereignty is, what the federal trust responsibility is, who are modern American Indian intellectuals and artists and leaders, and getting exposure to those things is a really important first step. And these stereotypes are also then, this is where this network of issues kind of comes to a point, and they're all reinforcing the same problem. So the social studies standards and other standards aren't necessarily addressing this. Well, some states are. So that was a 2015 study, and there are states that have actually started engaging in reform. But it's not just a social studies thing. But the curricular standards are reinforcing the stuck in the past image, but then you have the same issue in media. And so when teachers teach classes, they lean on media in order to help them supplement the learning of what's going on in the class. So if the media and all media are having this issue of, they really tend to focus on this fetishized, I'll call it exotic Indian stereotype with the feather headdress kind of situation. If you think about go-to Indian movies for a lot of people growing up. Some of the go-to Indian movies were Dances with Wolves and Last of the Mohicans. Like a go-to Indian movie is usually a stuck in the past stereotype as well. And sidebar, they tend to actually be about white people as the focal point, not necessarily the Indians. But so that media is having the same issue, and kids and adults learn from media outside of schools. And then you add in textbooks. So textbooks are written in connection with standards. So often the big states, Texas and California, drive how textbooks are created because they have such a large market. But basically textbooks are falling in the same trap. So you create a situation where a teacher is not necessarily trained to know any better, and they're working with a curriculum that's telling them to teach stuck in the past stereotypes, and they're using textbooks and media, and children's books also have the same problem that reinforce that same thing. And so this is such a systemic thing that you have to, at the classroom level, and remembering I come from education specifically, at the classroom or the learning moment, the people executing those lessons, if they're just simply aware that this stereotype is lurking in all things they do, we can teach about history, but all they have to do is make a decision to make a connection to contemporary Indians to show that they're still here. And so, hey, I'm teaching about, and the Trail of Tears is the token kind of thing that people learn about, right? You're teaching about the Trail of Tears, but also showing them the Cherokee Nation's website and their laws and their governmental structure. Those are all lessons that can be paired to show that they still exist. Who is their current leadership and things like that. So anyway, making those simple connections in those learning moments, whether it's museums, whether it's classrooms, whether it's wherever it is an important step to kind of start pushing back against this narrative.
Hey, I think that's great. And sorry, Dr. Mendoza, I'm going to ask this question because it fits perfectly into this.
Absolutely.
So my question is, how important was Randy Watson's comment in understanding the severity of the overall problem? And do you think institutions truly learn from that experience or are bound to repeat it?
So Commissioner Watson's comment just kind of fell into the same trap that all teachers, principals, and educators throughout the state are have the potential of falling into. And that's kind of why when we responded to it as the Kansas Association for Native American Education, it was like, we need to point out this larger infrastructure stuff that's feeding this narrative. And we need to start engaging in deeper dialogue about how Kansas is complicit in this conversation and how our systems could be built to better respond to these scenarios. And so I think that the key thing is understanding that those comments are shared by so many people. And Freddie, you've probably experienced people that say things that show that stereotype is lurking as well. I always share a story about, I was talking to somebody in the Johnson County area in recent years, and they said, they see my last name is Redcorn. They're like, oh, where's that coming from? And they see that I'm passing for white, so I'm not registering with their stereotype. And so they're trying to sort out, and they're asking questions, and there's always this kind of line of questions. And then, oh yeah, it's an Osage name. And she said, oh, I thought the Osage were extinct. And so, no, we're not. The Osage were removed from Kansas to make way for the state of Kansas and all of its institutions, but the Osage are still alive and well and growing and still maintaining their ways and doing good work to move our ways into the future and constantly evolving. Because I think that's an important piece too, is they're constantly evolving. We're not static people. And so anyway, that quote, oh, I thought the Osage were extinct, it's a shared thought by so many people, because they graduate from our schools in Kansas and they don't even understand that there are 4 tribes in Kansas right now. So yeah.
I think that also plays into a more interesting concept. I myself went to the University of Kansas when I was kind of going towards the end of my educational career. Towards my senior year, I started taking like easier classes because I was already phasing out. I took a history class, American Indian history class, and I remember one of our TAs. She was this white lady, blonde hair, man, and she pronounced my tribe, my kin tribe, Kiowa. She said Kiwa, and I kind of like my eye twitched a little bit. I was like, man, I never really heard that before. But it makes you wonder though, situations like that, people like that who are in those positions, it's like, man, like what gives, so that's something that was an interesting thing that I heard, that mispronunciation, and then calling the Nez Perce, the Nas Perce, like it was just kind of like, I was like, man, you're teaching us in college, yet you can't even pronounce this stuff. So, oh man. Anyways, Dr. Mendoza, you can take the next question.
Sure. Thank you, Freddie. I'm bringing up such good, good points. And, as part of this richer and fuller history, I wanted to take a little advantage of your expertise as well and ask you if you could talk a little bit about the history of your university, Kansas State, as it relates to Indigenous people and colonialism in particular.
Yeah, so when we bring Indigenous perspectives into universities, we have to recognize that universities were created for the purpose of conquest. And that trajectory hasn't necessarily changed. And what do I mean by that? So if I'm talking about K-State in particular, it was created from conquest and for conquest. So K-State likes to say we are the oldest operating land-grant institution in the country. And then there's kind of nitpicky fights about like, oh, okay, are they oldest operational? Who's actually the oldest? And really that claim is like, hey, we were the first ones to really steal people's land and make money off of it and actually build our institution from it. And so what we have to recognize and what we have to confront, I often use the phrase that we have to confront our colonial entanglements, otherwise we can't move forward. So that confrontation for us is recognizing that, especially with the help of the Land Grab Universities article, which I can put in the chat, or if somebody has a chance to put that, Land Grab U, it's a whole database, and you can go on that database and you can see specifically that K-State specifically benefited from the dispossession of Kaw land. So the Kaw Nation. And a lot of people at K-State do not currently know that the Kaw Nation still exists, even though the state of Kansas is named after it, and Kansas State University itself has the name Kansa within it as to be named after them. So if we want to talk about like honoring people, we're carrying that name and we like to say, oh, it's named after it, but a lot of people don't even know that they still exist. And we have a lot of work to do. And this is really where our land acknowledgement, recognizing that the Kaw Nation is the sole land dispossession that fed the funding of our university. We just have so much work to do to start moving beyond just acknowledging that. And that's what we're in the middle of trying to do right now. And what's important about that is you have to build relationships, and you have to do it in a good way. And sometimes that takes a while, and sometimes it takes a lot of small things over an extended period of time. But what we're also doing is we're trying to do substantive things, not just for the Kaw Nation, but also other Indigenous peoples. And so, for example, I'm gonna brag on my College of Education and my department. So the College of Education at K-State, I pursued my doctorate here for the sole purpose of convenience, and I had some people that seemed interested in helping me pursue the doctorate. I didn't expect a whole lot in terms of American Indian support in that process. But as I got in there, I found a willingness to put substance behind certain ideas that would directly benefit Indian country, and to do it in a good way where profit and enrollment numbers weren't the motive. They weren't the primary motive. Where it was like, no, we need to do this. And so they gave me a platform to start building relationships across Kansas and into Oklahoma, where I was able to build relationships with the Osage Nation. We did a couple cohorts of master's programs with the Osage Nation in Oklahoma. They created a platform for us to revive the Kansas Association for Native American Education. They're encouraging us to build relationships with the Kaw Nation, and we're looking for some starting points to where we can bring substance to that conversation in a good way, and not just, hey, we want to build a partnership with you because it'll make us look good. Like, we're trying to figure out how that looks right now. But they gave me a platform to create an Indigenous Educational Leadership Certificate program, where now we have substantive infrastructure and curriculum, an actual program made for ed leaders in Indian country specifically. Prior to that, you basically got to go get a mainstream ed leadership degree, and you're the one that's responsible for contextualizing it to Indian country. So I guess I'm going round and round, but basically that land grant status is not necessarily the greatest thing if you look at it from Indigenous perspectives. And I will say, from an Osage perspective, K-State, the University of Kansas, and the state of Kansas were all established in about I might be slightly off, but about a 10-year period in the latter half of the 1800s. That directly correlates with the removal of the Osage people from the state of Kansas. And what some people might not understand is that Osage culture and Osage ways started breaking down a little bit, and our elders had to make a decision in that moment with our last move from Kansas into Oklahoma, how to preserve those ways. And so those stories are out there where we have ceremonies that were built from that moment. So land grant institution, the establishment of these institutions for the purpose of conquest and colonialism, there's a flip side of that conversation that's related to removal.
Absolutely. I was going to say too that, we could spend the rest of the time just talking about the term land grant and breaking that down, right? But it's so nice to hear that, that your institution has been so supportive of you and, your work in making those connections, particularly with the Osage. So that's.
Yeah. And I think I might say this is not true everywhere, but there is a willingness of certain leaders in certain points of time to engage in this hard dialogue. And what happens when there's an openness to let that happen, even if it's awkward and uncomfortable, there's a lot of good things that can come out of that. And that's what land acknowledgements start. They start those conversations sometimes.
Yeah, and I see how the correlated effort with what you mentioned, with how K-State bolstered its infrastructure to support Indigenous education, and now reflected, look at what KU is doing with the appointment of Dr. Melissa Peterson, the Native American initiatives. So it's like this balance for what, we'll see. And so it's exciting.
What's great about that is there's an ebb and flow where we're KU and K-State, the conversations that Melissa and I have among other people at KU, we're in a way friendly, challenging each other in a friendly way to make things better at both of our institutions. And we work in partnership with each other a lot in lockstep to do collaborative work. That's for Indian country, not for KU and K-State.
Yeah. And that's Melissa Peterson, who is the Director of Tribal Relations at the University of Kansas. Shout out to Melissa Peterson.
So I wanted to bring up too something that's happened. I think it's just been in the last week with, I think it's the Andrew Mellon Foundation gave a grant to help remove Settlers Rock from Lawrence to another space. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Is this familiar to you?
So I probably wouldn't be the person to speak to the details of it. There's a handful of folks that were way more intimately involved in that, including Charlie Huffman from the Kaw Heritage Society, as well as James Pepper Henry was involved in that, vice chairman, and Ty Edwards at Johnson County Community College was also part. There is curricular efforts that spun off to it as well. So I'm not giving blanket acknowledgement of everybody involved, but what I would say is that that's another story that shows that, like, if you engage in the tough conversation and be honest about like these histories, instead of just being like, oh, that's in the past, we'll just let that go. There's a need to just be actually honest about this stuff. And I think I have an airplane flying over here, but if we're honest about them, then we can start the conversation and move it forward. So as an example, when it's the same conversation about K-State being honest about the land acknowledgement. And I often like to tell people, when people say, oh, that's history, just let it go, it happened a long time ago, there's a lot of treaties that were signed on paper, and there's real stuff. And the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were also written on paper even longer ago, and people still adhere to those pretty strictly. And so to just say, oh, that's history, it's gone, it's not necessarily true. Like, there were a lot of agreements that were made, and there were a lot of rights that were established that didn't dissolve, even though a lot of the people who were enacting these things just overlooked them and ignored them. So for example, people talk about the dispossession of call land. They're like, oh, this is, there was an agreement that was made. Well, okay, well, I can also, I can hold a gun to your head and ask for your car, and you hand me the keys to the car. I stole your car. You didn't willingly hand over the keys to the car. And so, like, acknowledging the conditions upon what a lot of these agreements were made, and understanding that these sovereign rights to these things are still in place, and that we have to acknowledge them.
Thank you.
It's just a good story to learn from.
Absolutely.
So we have two questions, both from the same person. So I guess we can go with this one. It says, Dr. Redcorn, what are your thoughts on CRT and book bannings? And then also wondering what your thoughts are in regards to land back ideas that revolve around returning national parks and native tribes.
Well, so I'll go with the second one first, because it's connected to what I was talking about before. A lot of land back stuff, I'm obviously in support of, because quite often, if we recognize that there were agreements made that actually call for that land to go back, there were provisional items in certain agreements that said, if this land goes unused, then you can have it back, type thing. And so really, I think, in general, anytime we have an opportunity to do something the right way that we know is right in this current context right now, even if we know that the white ancestors that did the work didn't do it in the right way, and they just had something on paper and then they just abused that. I think if we know better, we do better. That's been a common theme at our ConAE meeting last week. If we know better, do better. And we're so attached to the material and monetary value of some of these things that it tends to cloud our thinking about what is realistic to just give this thing back. Well, we have to recognize that non-natives have benefited directly from this wealth for generations, and they're still benefiting from it, even if they don't own that land in the current present moment. So to be honest about that means, okay, well, we're not just giving this away. We're trying to just bend this whole narrative of conquest and just destruction of Indian country, just bend it slightly with every little moment like that towards what we know is more appropriate and right. And for the other question, I think CRT is such a lightning rod word that it's just, no, there's so many people that say it and they don't actually know what they're talking about. They just know what they've been told to say about it. And so I wouldn't be for banning anything that offers critical thought. And actually, I don't know if I'm poking the bear too much, but I think if we recognize that even the Declaration of Independence is critical thought. It's a critical pushback of when there are abuses of power, and when power is distributed in inappropriate ways, or if people are using power in inappropriate ways, and how it benefits some but not others, and how something's not fair. Like the the founding fathers had a layer of critical thought in the work they do, and the work they did to establish this, even though it was also paralleled with, conquest of American Indian populations, or attempted conquest of American Indian populations. But my point is, I'm not a fan of taking any critical thought out of our learning systems, because that's what makes us better. And to do that basically turns stuff into propaganda. It de-emphasizes thinking and thinking critically about hard topics, and it re-emphasizes think about this topic in this way because this is the American story and we can't be overly critical about it. I mean, it's built into our Constitution that we can be critical about things that have happened before and that we can amend it. If you don't have room for critical thought to amend these things, then it's not there. So basically, I'm just saying that CRT has been misinterpreted, and I think we need to understand that fields of thought associated with things like CRT allow us to talk honestly about how K-State as a land grant institution used call land. So we're making space for those conversations right here, and we need those conversations to occur.
And Dr. Redcorn, that falls into this other question that was asked from Tracy Peterson that said, does K-State recognize treaties used to dispose tribal nations from Kansas? If so, how are they used to educate the university community?
So thanks for that question, Tracy. And funny thing is, there's a project going on right now at K-State that's focused entirely on call treaties. And where it's in the Chapman Center for Rural Studies. They're starting to get a web presence, so there might even be a website up and going. Or actually, I saw it the other day. I just don't know if it's live for everybody. But basically, there's a project going on right now with the Chapman Center where people are doing the work to dive into call treaties and annotate them so we can make them more public and digestible for the public. When I say we, I'm not leading that project, so I can't take any credit for it. But Mary Cohn and Lisa Tatanetti have been doing that work, and they've also been trying to collaborate with call citizens in doing that work. And they've also been hiring American Indian undergraduate research assistants to pay them to engage in that work as well. And so there's stuff brewing at K-State that's looking into that. And I'm really excited that we'll eventually be able to start tying it to our land acknowledgement. So the land acknowledgement becomes an educational tool. So when you read that, you can hyperlink and see actual treaties that were part of that land dispossession, if that makes sense.
And that land acknowledgement is part of the resources in the big idea. If y'all scroll down to the bottom of that, you can see that. Well, I wanted again to use this as kind of an educate thing and take advantage of you in that way. In that, in many cases, when I think of land acknowledgements, I think of them as a one-off, right? That the person is kind of performing in land acknowledgement can think, okay, I've done my bit. I've been, respectful. I've acknowledged, that these lands, belonged isn't the right word, but were, settled on, used by natives before I got here. So, I'm not going to, not necessarily like we were talking about, think about native issues, in a more fuller perspective. And so as you were talking earlier, you mentioned, let's get to know Native intellectuals, artists, leaders, as part of bringing a fuller perspective to land acknowledgements. So can you give us some of those, artists, intellectuals, and leaders that you would recommend that we learn about?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's important to look local. And so wherever you're at, the land acknowledgement is going to look different. And so Kansas is just, I'm sorry, but Kansas is one of the hardest states to start doing land acknowledgements in, because There were indigenous peoples here before. There were lots of indigenous nations moved through, ended up in Oklahoma, a lot of them. And there are still 4 federally recognized tribes in Kansas that aren't indigenous to Kansas. And so that being said, when I say look local, so I would just say when you engage in the act of trying to develop a land acknowledgement, it's the act of educating yourself about the history of that place. And so if you can educate yourself about the history of that place, so for example, if you are in the suburban Kansas City area, understanding that that near Kansas City gets kind of complicated because it was the confluence of rivers, but you have a lot of connection to Kaw and Osage history, but you also have the Shawnees and Wyandots that move through. And so if you're going to engage in that land acknowledgement, understanding that, okay, well, where are the Kaw now? Who are their leaders? Who are their artists? For example, so who are their leaders and who are their artists? Who are the Osage? Where are they now? Who are their leaders? Who are their artists and writers? There are lots of Osage artists out there that I can connect you with. My brother being one of them. He's the Elompa of our family, which is the eldest son, and so I have to give a shout out to him, but also give him a hard time that he thinks he's hot stuff because he's got fancy photographs online. No, I'm just kidding. But he is an excellent artist. And so there's a whole network and there's screenwriters too. I mean, he's a screenwriter and they're connected to other screenwriters. But then recognizing the Shawnee, and so like Chief Ben Barnes and his work, he has a presence up in Kansas City. He's up there a lot, making sure he's visible. And then the Wyandots. And so basically look local and then start looking for people who fit and are connected to those communities, because it becomes much more place-based and meaningful than just going out looking for generic American Indians. If we're going to build that local understanding, it starts with that local research to figure out where to look for the modern contemporary versions and leaders and thought leaders of those communities.
Yeah, and shout out to Chief Barnes. He's doing a lot of great things, especially with a lot of the retelling of the actual history that happened in Johnson County. So I can only commend what he's doing and only give a shout out to that. So that's tough work, especially to be able to maintain and lead that, especially with such integrity and forthright. So anyways, we have a lot of questions, but I'm just gonna go and ask this one because so it said, your work with developing a master cohort with the Osage sounds powerfully important and a positive step for supporting Indigenous teachers. Can you tell more about that work?
So that was a partnership program between K-State and the Osage Nation, in which we had 2 cohorts of master's degrees in educational leadership. And so I didn't pursue a 3rd cohort because one of the things we were doing was we were trying to take a mainstream ed leadership program, and I make the joke that we're trying to Wajajify it. So Wajaji is Osage and Osage. So we're trying to Wajajify it to make sure it resonated in that way, because we have to recognize that if you are an Osage, Kaw, Shawnee citizen, and you go get a teaching degree at Kansas State University, and then you come back to contribute to your community and to be a leader in your community. That's like the line of thinking, right? We'll go to college, we'll come back, we're going to be leaders in our community for the next generation. Well, when you're at K-State, Emporia State, KU, Oklahoma State, most likely you did not learn your native language. You did not learn your own native history, your own tribe's history. You do not understand your own tribal governance structure and the policies and procedures to move through those to that governance. You may have taken a political science class where you learned about the United States government or Kansas state government, but not necessarily your tribe's government. You didn't necessarily learn what the federal trust responsibility was, and you didn't necessarily learn about the Marshall Trilogy and its connection to that. You didn't necessarily learn all those fundamental stuff that's actually relative to Indian experiences. And so this first 2 cohorts, they weren't perfect, but it was an attempt to create something that wasn't for generic leadership. It was for leadership in the Osage community. And like I said, it wasn't perfect, but it makes me proud to say that we have several graduates of our programs leading Osage Nation education programs in the Osage Nation right now. So we took out the idea that, hey, pull yourself out of the res, go to the university, come back to the res, and you just said, no, stay there. We'll come to you and we will build a program for you in your community. And I hope that's making an impact in some way. But yeah, so the reason I didn't pursue a third cohort was because I realized that we needed to create a program specifically for American Indian communities instead of trying to Wajajify everything, if that makes sense. So we created the new Indigenous Ed Leadership Certificate program that rolls out in July. It's brand new, just recently approved. It's a 12-hour graduate certificate program that is built for a lot of American Indian ed leaders have to learn on the job because they weren't trained on how that stuff works. You're not trained on the Bureau of Indian Education, the Office of Indian Education, Title VI, Johnson O'Malley, the ANA in the Department of Health and Human Services. These are all like Indian education bureaucracies that you just have to figure it out when you get your first job. And so we're trying to alleviate that to help train people to be more prepared for those positions, so they're ready to go in a more appropriate way. And so that certificate program's there in a way, and we made it a certificate so it can be paired with all the other graduate degrees. And so counseling, ed leadership, adult learning and leadership. So it's a malleable thing that can be attached to a whole lot of programs.
Yeah, that's a lot. You're doing great work, and it's kind of tempting me to go to K-State, but I don't know if I can ever do that in my entire life. Only because I'm red and crimson and blue.
I got my first 2 degrees from KU.
I know, but that's why I'm appalled. No, I'm just kidding. So anyways, I have a question that I'm going to ask, and then we can go into the couple more Q&As that we have. So personally, I have a problem with land acknowledgements, and I only view them as performative and disingenuous. For skeptics such as myself, for whatever reason they have, whether they're a part of an organization that's been lackluster or they wish to see more effort in doing something as opposed to the effort taken into the acknowledgement itself, what can you say to those that are considering developing one, but don't really know how to go about it, in the good way?
Yeah, and so that in a good way was a late addition to my title, because I was trying to figure out. I let it sit for a little bit. I came back to it, and that's just how Indian people refer to it. When you say you're approaching something in a good way, you don't really have to over-explain it. But so that was my way of recentering the conversation to Native people and Native experiences. But what's really important is I agree with you 100%. If you are doing this in a disingenuous way and you're not really trying to actually look hard at how your institution is or is probably not serving Indigenous peoples, then there's no point in doing it, because you're not going to accomplish what you think you're trying to accomplish. And so I think your critique is spot on. And I think critiques, because we should offer room for critiques of certain things, right? Not just obliterate, oh, this is always the right way of doing something. But I think your critique's right on, and I've seen other people critique. For example, recently in a talk, Jim Pepper Henry of the Kaw Nation said they're people acknowledgements. We're not actually acknowledging the land, you're acknowledging the people. And some of that conversation moves to the idea that land is actually socioculturally a much deeper thing than just, a commodity to be bought, sold, and exploited, mined, or turned into profit. And so I think your criticism's fine, and I agree with it. And I think that the only way a land acknowledgement's worth even tackling is if you're trying to do it in a good way and you're actually asking substantive questions about what your institution is going to do differently than to move the needle, to educate people, to make histories visible, to make present people visible, to find scholarship dollars, to build relationships, to open up pathways for American Indians in education, and not just open it up in a way that you think it needs to happen, but how the American Indian communities around you actually think is best. Indian country is kind of used to non-Indians coming in and saying, this is what you need. And so there's a part of that don't be in a hurry, engage in the dialogue and try to listen and try to be present and try to decenter your institution as the priority.
Yeah, that's some good words right there. So speaking about what you're talking about, the institutions and everything, here's a question. It said both Kansas State and KU have been mentioned today in this conversation, but they're curious if other state universities are examining their relationships with Indigenous stories, past and present.
So I'll connect back to when we were mentioning Melissa Peterson's work at KU. So Melissa Peterson's work at KU actually has inspired us at K-State to rehash our land acknowledgement. We're in the process of the revising and updating. But in those conversations, we've actually been connected to some folks in Emporia who are trying to do, not necessarily, it hasn't been specific to land acknowledgement, but there are new initiatives or a small working group of people in Emporia who are engaging in this conversation as well. And so other than that, while it was not land acknowledgement specifically, we did have somebody from Wichita State University at our ConAE meeting last Friday, who's trying to do some work around art education. And other than that, though, I'm not totally sure if there's how many people might be, how many universities might be doing that. I do think the more substantive stuff is coming from this ebb and flow from KU and K-State. And we've vocally said that we would like to be leaders in this and do it right and do it better every time we update, and not just get something in place and dust our hands off and say we did it.
Yeah, for sure. Here's another question. So you've offered wonderful suggestions for educators to implement in the classroom, whether it's K through 12 or higher education, including the idea of land acknowledgements. In your opinion, how can local, specifically rural historical societies and museums be supportive of their Indigenous past and present? Basically, how can you help museums that probably never seen really natives around?
So this is hard because museums, if you really get into some of the academic side, museums have a problematic history with Indians, where they wanted to go get their artifacts and put them on display for people to learn from, and they did it in very exploitative ways. And so I think one of the things to recognize is that connecting to the contemporary Indian and engaging with contemporary Indians, not just the people, especially if you're a museum and you're talking about representation, there's a lot of stuff that's really important to recognize. And you could tell these stories about the growth of NAGPRA, Native American Graves and Repatriation Act. So for anybody that doesn't know, that's basically if you have, I'm not a NAGPRA person, so I'm going to mess this up. But basically, if you have American Indian artifacts that you were acquired and don't belong to you, then there's a repatriation process for them. So what that means is there's a need to engage with the nations you're representing and make sure that they're aware, and you have to be conscious that they have historical preservation departments that engage in this partnership building, and that they're the ones that are tasked with almost controlling their narrative, because a lot of their narratives were taken and co-opted, and you have a lot of non-natives telling the story of natives without actually consulting the natives. And so the process of engaging with communities and those historic preservation offices from the perspective of a museum is the process of starting a conversation about, in a way that lets them get involved in how they're being represented within these museums. And that's a really important piece. And I would just say, besides that, I would say just make the contemporary American Indian visible. And if you have sacred objects, ask hard questions about whether you should have those sacred objects.
Yeah, you can do that by having a powwow too. Anyways, so that was a good question. So here's another one. Do you have any advice for getting a group of Indigenous staff and faculty involved in the development of an institutional land acknowledgement, rather than send a draft to everyone for review on their own time? I want them to be compensated and actively participate, or at the very least encourage them to share feedback. Do you have any lessons learned from the process at KU? I think they're trying to.
So I would just say, focus on the relationships building even within your institutions. The relationships have to be there. You have to lead with relationships, and you have to lead with respect. And just kind of when I hear the phrase draft language being circulated around for people to edit, that's not relationship building. That's putting words on paper. And so I would make sure that don't be in a hurry and engage in the process. And this is really something that that we've been learning from KU, is that they're really more focused on the process than we were when we first initiated land acknowledgement at K-State. And so that's what we're revisiting, is our whole process. So when I say process, it's okay, who are the faculty and staff that could be involved in this? And if there was kind of a tone in that question too, that they're acknowledging that this is going to be extra work for them. And so how can we compensate them? Because diversity fatigue is a real thing in these things too, where I've given so many Indian 101 conversations on our campus and other people's campuses that it's diversity fatigue, you know? And so recognizing that diversity fatigue is a thing, and thinking about how you could create a process to do the research, figure out who the key people you need to be reaching out to might be. For example, look at your local history and figure out where those nations are. Figure out if they have any statements on land acknowledgements, figure out if they have any statements on their own history that you can learn from. So go through that learning process and do it together as a working group. The working group can include Indigenous faculty and staff, but there are also allies that can help carry some of the burden of that work if you're doing it in a good way. And so create a process and set some goals, but start the dialogue, and with the intent of putting action behind it eventually, and building relationships outward as well.
So we have about 8 minutes or so, but it's all right. We have another question. They want you to clarify what you mean by diversity fatigue. You just briefly mentioned it, and I understand what you're talking about, but for those that, you know, are not familiar with that term, can you specify that?
Yeah, so diversity fatigue is a phrase referencing when you represent a certain group at an institution, every time somebody needs to learn about that group, they call on you to give a presentation or a public talk about it. And so diversity fatigue, meaning it's in my contract to do work at the campus level, right? I'm supposed to be engaged in committees and do work on campus, but my contract is mostly focused on teaching my students and doing some research. But within my contract, I'm going above and beyond and doing a whole bunch of extra presentations that are kind of above what I'm supposed to do on paper. I'm doing it because I care about it and I'm passionate about it and I know it needs to happen. But sometimes that can get a little bit exhausting for people, and it leads to burnout. And so respecting that and thinking about, if you overwork people and ask them to do too much, you could actually be burning out some of your people of color or your minoritized populations within your faculty and staff ranks, and then you might lose them entirely. So that's what I mean by diversity fatigue.
Gotcha. So that's a great term. Here's another question. So it says, as a leader in the faith community, they're wondering if you have any counsel for faith communities, especially as it relates to ethics, spirituality, and justice and light in the history of colonialism and religion. Repeat that again. That was kind of like
no, I got it, and I'm getting a notification of a low battery, so I need to make sure I don't disappear on you. But that's kind of a loaded question.
Yeah, so
I'm gonna get.
I'll break it down again. It was pretty loaded. It was like a Jeopardy question for.
So no, but I think I'm good at just.
Okay.
It's loaded because I think I said this earlier. I often use the phrase entanglements, or maybe that was in a different thing that I was in this morning, but I often use the phrase entanglements and colonial entanglements. And I've gotten that phrase from Gene Dennison, an Osage anthropologist who used it. But we're entangled with faith-based organizations in very unique ways, and every community and every family is going to be different across those communities. For example, so we cannot deny that faith-based organizations and missionary schools were the leaders in assimilationist Indian education movements in the 1800s, where they wanted to basically Americanize, Christianize, and quote unquote, kill the Indian, save the man, even though that's been associated with the federal school, not necessarily the religious school. So that assimilation and church are inherently entangled with one another. However, through the processes of trying to survive, adapt, and move forward, you have different families and different communities that have these traditional religions and they have these Christian religions, and how they work together is different in a very localized church by church manner sometimes. And so I'm saying this as the descendant of pastors of the Baptist, Osage pastors of the Baptist Church. And so as somebody who has a white Irish Catholic side of the family on my mother's side, and then a Southern Baptist, Osage Southern Baptist side of the family on my dad's side, I've seen all this play out. But I think I'll just go back to the same conversation about when a land grant institution needs to confront those colonial entanglements, these faith-based organizations also need to confront those entanglements, and they need to have hard conversations about their history and their role in trying to rid an entire group of people of their cultural lifeways. And not only that, but there's also, it's a deeper thing, and I'm not the person that could really speak with this to authority, but the early Indian law Supreme Court decisions were actually also rooted in church type stuff with doctrine of discovery. And so there's some experts that could talk with way more authority on this than I could, but the doctrine of discovery is inherently connected, even legally, to the history of Indian law in this country. And I think it's still alive because it's been connected to those things.
Yeah, the doctrine of discovery, that's a lot what Billy Mills was talking about. You know, he always was a big, strong critique of it whenever he would speak to us. So before we wrap this up, one more question. Is K-State or Kansas currently offering full tuition or reduced tuition for Indigenous students? If not, have those conversations started?
I have, yes. Yes, and I'm very passionate about this, and it's like moving a big behemoth when you're talking about some of these institutions. So at my department level, it's easier at the department level to do. We have some American Indian specific ed leadership scholarships at the department level. At the university level, I have started the conversation about Call Nation scholarships specifically. So when we're talking about what are we going to do to actually, we're going to put out this Call Nation land acknowledgement. So I've started the conversation with administrators about Call scholarships specifically, and so that's in motion, and we have active meetings about it currently. At the state level, our Kansas Association for Native American Education has advocated for several years to get, at minimum, in-state tuition for American Indians that have history with American Indians from nations that have history with the state of Kansas. So what that looks like, that's also a conversation in motion. And a few years ago, we were able to get it to where out-of-state citizens of the 4 tribes can get in-state tuition. But yes, those are all in motion, and I'm advocating for those in the background. Yes. And I'll just say I love the question, and I think I came from Tracy too, right? Yeah, I love the question because the logic behind in-state tuition is that people pay taxes, therefore they should have more access and cheaper access to these institutions. Okay, well, American Indians have paid taxes through those lands, and so those lands, that tax has been paid a long time ago, and now these institutions owe those citizens of those nations tenfold, 20-fold more than just free tuition. Tuition is a drop in the bucket for what is actually
Hey, we signed the Treaty of Medicine laws. Are we included too, or what?
So no, you got to understand, I have an active list of tribes with historical ties to Kansas. Ty Edwards has been helping with Con AE keep track of that list, and we have, I think we're close to 30, and so I think y'all are on the list.
we were just passing. We had no business being down here anyway, so that's
Well,
how it is.
Well, that's crazy, and we're running out of time. But the Western Plains of Kansas, as hunting grounds for so many tribes that we're moving through, to define it in these like neat terms of land ownership, it doesn't work for Kansas as neatly. But we're trying to document as much as we can so we can make that argument and be specific about it.
Yeah. So before I wrap up, Dr. Mendoza, do you have anything you wanna say to Dr. Redcorn here on this wonderful?
Just thank you so much for your time and generosity. You have tons of kudos in the chat, so be sure to take a look at those, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, so we would like to extend our sincerest appreciation to Dr. Redcorn. He's a busy individual. And for those in the audience today, for the big idea discussion titled Turning Land Acknowledgements into Action in a Good Way. Join us next month on May 19th at 12 o'clock, high noon, for our season finale of the big idea discussion. Man, it's been that quick. Dr. Mendoza, it's been already 9 months. That's crazy. The last episode will be featuring Dr. Andrew McKenzie, linguistics professor at the University of Kansas, as we dive into the Kiowa language, his work in understanding the importance of language revitalization and reclamation. So it's going to be a good conversation. Anyways, have a great rest of your day. Dr. Redcorn, take care, be safe, have a good conference, and we'll see you next month. Aho, and take care.
Baby, no, thank you. And yeah, we got a lot of work to do.
Definitely. Take care.
Take care.